7 years ago, I led an extensive meta-analysis, which is basically statistically combining existing studies. And we included over 50 randomized trials that lasted a year or more. And David Ludwig is the co-author on that study, actually. We, from the same institution over at Harvard in the nutrition department. And our hypothesis there almost had nothing to do with carbohydrate intake and was addressing the low fat era that seemed to still have this kind of residual dogma that low fat was best for weight loss. And our hypothesis going in was that low fat, because it's, potentially related to so many poor health choices in terms of like low fat products being more ultra processed and higher in refined carbs, may not in fact be better for longer term weight loss or weight gain prevention. And so we included all these low fat trials. And when we look at low fat versus low carb, low fat versus other higher fats, essentially very little difference or benefit was found for low carb over low fat in these trials. It was about just over 1 kilogram, I think, maybe 2 pounds. So if there were some major benefit of just simply eliminating carbohydrates, then we would anticipate a greater benefit for the low carb diet. And then if you look at adherence within these trials, there were no differences. So again, if it's an internally motivated drive to choose to over consume calories, or even if it's not conscious, it's below the subconscious, that's clearly not what we're seeing in terms of low carb just being better to adhere to and that leading to more weight loss in the real world setting. So yeah, that literature doesn't really line up as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting at this point to see that, if we're controlling for protein intake and we're controlling for energy intake, then like you said, it's not really mattering whether we're going low carb or low fat to achieve the weight loss. Yet, still a major claim from when I see it, especially with practitioners or doctors who are ascribing to the carbohydrate insulin model, is really in relation to hunger. Hunger seems to be this driving theme. And of course, in their paper talking about the carbohydrate insulin model, talking about how patients may experience less hunger and improved energy levels. And of course, they call it spontaneous weight loss, I suppose. Now, you address this in your paper as well in terms of confounders, and you discuss this with some of the outpatient controlled feeding studies around lower glycemic load, higher glycemic load diets and satiety. Can you unpack that a little bit for listeners?
Yeah. So, if you're attempting to isolate one specific component of diet, like glycemic index, which is what should be the predictor of carbohydrate quantity and quality in other foods that are being consumed in that meal. So this glycemic load is the overall picture of what we would anticipate physiologically your insulin response and your glucose response might be with a meal, right? So this glycemic load, taking all that into account, is really difficult to manipulate between two diets without also changing many other aspects of the diet. So if there's a single feature that we want to kind of test in a model, then you have to hold everything else constant. Otherwise, it's almost impossible to say, was it that switch or was it like all these other switches we had to switch at the same time, right? Yeah, so glycemic index is very difficult, if not impossible, to achieve, having one diet low glycemic, one diet medium and high, or whatever it might be, without also changing quantities of either fat or protein or quality of carbohydrates. And as you start impacting these other sort of non-glycemic index related features of your diet, of your intervention, then the causality can't be attributed to any one thing. Mm-hmm. And so, I almost wonder how impossible it might be down the road to even investigate this hypothesis, because unless there are some really well-controlled, and I'm thinking of like shakes or something like that, like meal replacements where you can, very fine-tunedly manipulate and control everything in the diet and know that you're directly comparing the one difference of interest. It makes it almost impossible to really tease out causally what is contributing to any effects that might be seen down the road. So if you see differences in satiety, if you see differences in weight and fat mass loss and whatever it might be, then you can attribute those very specifically to the one thing you manipulated. Without that, it's confounding, even though we're talking about a clinical trial, because You just can't attribute it to one versus the other.
Yeah, I mean, it gets tricky, doesn't it, in terms of even when we look at research on glycemic index, obviously with weight loss, not being able to, as you mentioned, you can't predict in terms of weight loss, whether it's a higher glycemic or lower glycemic, because we're influencing all these other factors. And of course, we see with some of the continuous glucose monitoring research that how I respond to a banana might be different than how somebody else responds to a banana in terms of their glycemic response or blood sugar response. And so that's could be obviously be playing a role here as well.
Yeah, and then even within your own banana experiment, if you ate one this week and then ate one next week, some of the CGM data are showing even within an individual very different responses. Maybe a banana would have been, toxic on a carb level today, but fine next week. So it's hard to say. Yeah,
for sure. And if you had to sort of, postulate or guess around, some of the this notion of hunger being such a cornerstone, especially for a lot of docs who struggled themselves with weight gain and then realize some weight loss on, say, lower carbohydrate diets. This is, again, a really area of big focus. And oftentimes, as a practitioner, I think to myself, the experience is still valid in terms of what they're experiencing. They're just probably ascribing it to something that's not quite there. And what other factors would you think might be contributing to that idea of less hunger? Is it the fact that they're increasing protein intake, or the vegetable and fiber intake goes up, or some of these other downstream effects that happen when we change a diet?
Yeah, I mean, it could be all of the above, and it probably is a multifactorial exposure or change that's occurring. I'd love to know when someone experiences a shift in their diet and witnesses an outcome, exactly what it was. But unless you have the person go do the exact same thing over again without that, or with a different exposure or diet, and see what happens then, this kind of like counterfactual scenario of what if I manipulated this one thing differently, then what would it have been? It's almost impossible to say. And I think it's very desirable to kind of draw cause and effects in things we do and attribute it to something. And if the individual is satisfied with a diet and it works for them, I don't see any reason to challenge what they're in their mind attributing it to. But biologically and scientifically, that's not the game that's being played, right? We're looking by the more biological black box that's occurring between the exposure and the outcome, and why and how. And there is a lot of variability in a population between people. So, there's not going to be, I think, one way that works for everybody, or one biology that's everyone's truth. Because we, may experience the environment differently, but we might also have different genes that explain how we interact with that environment differently. And so there's expected to be a lot of heterogeneity anyway. And then to be able to kind of pin someone's experience on a specific metabolic pathway underlying that, I think would be, if someone needs an anecdote to support whatever their experience has been, I don't see a problem with that. But again, when it comes to then elevating what science is finding to a population level, there needs to be more of an evidence base than that.